We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
My name is Oz Davis, and this is Truly the GOATs, sports history as told through its superstars.
Beginning next week is the world's second largest international sports competition, the Paralympic Games, an event with a surprisingly long and interesting history, starting with roots as physical rehabilitation and therapy for World War II veterans. Guesting on this extra edition of Truly the GOATs is now three-time guest Dr. Dennis Frost. Dennis has previously joined Truly the GOATs for episode 6 on sumo wrestling and episode 14 on 1920s track and field superstar Kinyue Hitomi, but his latest book, entitled More Than Medals, A History of the Paralympics and Disability Sports in Post-War Japan, shows his academic specialization. In the following interview, Dennis talks to us about Paralympics history, the influence of the Games on Japanese culture, the local population's reaction to hosting another mega sports event after a pretty controversial locally Tokyo Olympics, a couple of notable, or notorious, Paralympians of the past, China's recent dominance of the Games, and, since this is Truly the GOATs, a handful of GOAT Paralympians. Enjoy. Dennis, thanks for completing the three-peat here on Truly the GOATs.
Yeah, thanks again for having me back. I really enjoy being here.
Great. Well, let's get into it. I'm really interested to know a lot more about Paralympics. I'm sure most of our audience doesn't. And so I'd like to talk to you first off. Your second book, More Than Medals, A History of the Paralympics and Disability Sports in Post-War Japan, is quite indicative of your academic specialization. How did you get interested in Paralympic sports and specifically in Asia?
So my interest in Asia came first. That actually came out of my undergraduate experience. So when I was in high school, I had never really had any exposure to Japan or China or Korea, any of those places. And so when I got to college, I had the opportunity to start taking Japanese, and I did. And within like the first couple of weeks, I was like, wow, I really love this. And I think I'm going to make a career of studying the language. Didn't yet know I was going to become a professor. That came a little bit later, but and then I spent some time in Japan studying abroad, and that led me to decide I wanted to study Japanese history. Ended up, kind of fast forward a bit, ended up in graduate school, was looking for a research project for my dissertation, and ended up producing the dissertation about what became the first book about the history of sports stars. So I've been working on sports for quite a while. And then I was actually teaching a class at actually my alma mater. I taught for a year there, and a student had asked me about, they were doing class presentations on the Nagano Olympics. And so one of the students in that group came to me and said, could I do my presentation on the Nagano Paralympics? And I said, sure, because I'm always eager to let students do what they're interested in. But I was like, how in the world, I've been studying sports now for like 5-6 years. How do I not know about this event? And so, I was like, this is ridiculous. I knew Japan, knew Japanese history. I was like, I knew a lot about sports Japan, but I didn't know about this. And so when I started looking, I realized there really wasn't much in English. Not even at that point a lot in Japanese available, easily accessible in Japanese. And so I was like, this sounds like a great project. So that's kind of the initial kind of impetus. And that was back right around 2006, 2007. So well before, Tokyo got the right to host the 2020, 2021 games. So I've been kind of thinking about this for a long, long time. And then the other impetus is, my youngest son, he was born with spina bifida right around the same time I was starting to kind of think about kind of a new book project. He was born with spina bifida and was getting to the age where he was starting to take an interest in sports. He uses a wheelchair for especially for distance and things like that. And so we kind of knew we were going to have to look for something adapted for him to do sports. And so fortunately, we found some programs near us here in Michigan. And we were able kind of to be involved in that. So it's kind of come at me from both directions, kind of this academic interest, which emerged over time, and then this kind of personal side where my son is very involved now in wheelchair sports. In fact, we're going to a wheelchair tennis tournament this weekend. So all sorts of stuff like that. It's kind of intersected in really interesting and complex ways for me.
Yeah, actually, through your work in researching this episode, I actually first heard about the wheelchair marathon.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, whoa, that's insane. Is it actually 26 miles?
Yes.
Jeez.
So, yeah. And in the early days of the marathon, the wheelchair marathons, this is true in all the early wheelchair marathons, they used essentially like their everyday chairs. So now the marathon chairs are like, there's these souped up like racing chairs, super lightweight. But back in the original days, back in the 80s, when they were first starting wheelchair marathons, people were using essentially like a standard wheelchair.
Yeah, like the boxy one.
Yeah, which you can imagine, like pushing that, 26 miles. That's, it's not designed for that. So a lot of people talk about like the early kind of descriptions of that event. There's actually descriptions of people like they're like showing off their blisters on their hands and things like that.
I bet.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
Okay, let's start at the beginning of the Paralympic movement. Now, as I understand it, this was begun in Britain for war veterans. Is that correct?
Yeah, so and there is some stuff that comes before that, and if you're looking kind of the broader history of sports for people with different disabilities, there's activities for people that were visually impaired, people that had deaf athletes. So there's a history that precedes this as well. But what we think of the Paralympics really is dated to about 1948 in England. Started at a hospital that was designed to treat. It was set up to treat people that were injured in World War II, that had spinal cord injuries, so they're paralyzed in some form or another. And then, of course, after the war ends, people still continue to be injured in accidents or have illnesses and stuff that lead to paralysis. And so it started in 1948 and then kind of continued to spread gradually out from England. And the key figure there is a guy by the name of Ludwig Gutmann. He's the guy who kind of is credited, is often described as the father of the Paralympics. Okay,
but in 1960, the Paralympic Games come to Rome, which is highly symbolic for any sport event. And that's usually recognized as the first official Paralympics. Now, why? What happened in 1960?
So in 1960, part of why they're considered the first Paralympics is it was the first time that the Paralympics were held in conjunction essentially with the Olympics. So the Olympics were held in Rome, of course, that year in 1960, also a really big year. And then soon after that, the Paralympics were held using some of the same venues, not exactly the same venues. And I don't think they used the Athletes Village. I can't remember for sure. But so that's why it's kind of seen as kind of the first official Paralympics, because it was kind of linked directly with the Olympics. It was also the first games that left England. So the games before that had all been, so 48, they would have them pretty much every year. They would have an event in England. At the time, they were called the Stoke Mandeville Games, named after the hospital where they happened. And still, through really up until like the 1970s, you still see them referred to sometimes as the Stoke Mandeville Games. So even though the games in Rome were still called the Stoke Mandeville Games, they were just the Stoke Mandeville Games in Rome, and the ones in Tokyo in 64 were the Stoke Mandeville Games in Tokyo.
Yeah, let's talk about 64, because as you've described in your work, this is when Tokyo gets to host the Paralympics, and it really had this profound change of their society, like we always hope for in these big sports events. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, so the Paralympics, I mean, part of the fascinating story, and this is one of the things, I had no idea about these games when I first started looking into them. I vaguely knew they had happened, but didn't know much about kind of their history and background. What was pretty remarkable about it is that Japan if you had looked at this in 1960 and said Japan's going to host the Paralympics in 4 years, everybody knew they were hosting the Olympics, but the Paralympics were not a requirement. They were essentially still new, right? They're less than like 12 years old at that point. Nobody knows about these games. In Japan, very few people at all knew that they existed. And so even some of the organizers that become key figures in the Paralympic movement in 64, they had never heard of the games in 1960. And so the fact that they end up hosting in 64 is really remarkable. And it's this fascinating story of kind of like all this kind of scrambling around to get funding and all that type of stuff. So it's a really great story. But what they do end up having a pretty profound impact in several ways. And one of them is the fact that, as I said, there was no real awareness of the Paralympics before this in Japan. And so if nothing else, it kind of suddenly puts the Paralympics on the map in the Japanese society. It also, Japan didn't really have institutions in place to promote sports for people with disabilities. It was not something that they were kind of involved in doing at the time. And in fact, no Japanese athletes had ever participated before 1962 in any of those events in England or the ones in Rome. So, so the fact that you then get the Paralympics happen and then you start seeing all these institutions created. So in terms of sports, it's a huge development. It also led to kind of a lot of new ideas about rehabilitation, because the games at that point were very much still oriented around this kind of medical benefit, that this is designed to help people with disabilities, achieve rehabilitation, get back to work, get back to living in society. And in Japan at the time, the kind of idea for a lot of people, especially with kind of severe spinal cord injuries and forms of paralysis, would be that they probably were thinking they're going to spend a good portion of their lives in the hospital, the rest of their lives in the hospital or some sort of rehabilitation facility, or maybe at home, right, with their family. So part of what you see is that suddenly there's this discussion about, well, maybe that doesn't have to be the case. And so, it does have a pretty profound impact. There's also ways in which, one of the things I talk about in the book is it's not all positive, of course. Because it does reinforce in some ways it challenges some stereotypes and it reinforces others. So it's this kind of complicated situation, but it is kind of a fascinating moment that without the games in '64, it would have looked like a very different situation in Japan after that.
Okay, let's talk about this. The Paralympic Games don't tend to hit the mainstream sports consciousness very much. However, I can think of at least two somewhat recent examples. So I'd like to ask you about that. Okay, first off, there was the 1992 Games, which are, in my opinion, one of the greatest Olympic Games ever. And a lot of people look upon that as the first modern 21st century Olympics, if you will, post-Cold War Olympics. And at that Olympics, of course, the Paralympic archer Antonio Raballo lit the torch in one of the most famous torch lightings ever. Did that have any sort of impact on Paralympic athletes in the Paralympics?
So actually what was happening at that point in time is that the Paralympics itself was kind of reorganizing. And so part of what you're seeing there is a consequence of those kind of institutional reorganizations, which are on paper, and they're pretty dry. So I'm not going to kind of go into great detail here. But essentially what happens is you get an organization that is set up to parallel the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, on the Paralympic side. Before that, it was kind of different groups of people. And it kind of, for a lot of people that were organizing these big events, it felt kind of unorganized because you had to work with like 6 different groups instead of like one central committee. And so what you see is that in the 90s, you start seeing them kind of consolidate into this thing called now known as the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC. And that had a pretty profound impact on kind of, it led to closer integration with the Olympics. It led to increased funding. It's right in around the 2000s where you start seeing more emphasis being placed on the games are going to have to start agreeing to host the Paralympics too. It's not just kind of an add-on event that's voluntary like it was, back in the 60s and really all the way up into the 90s. It was still kind of voluntary. They weren't required to host these events. And so that's partly why you're seeing athletes from the Paralympics participating in Olympics. There's different kind of events that are being held. They're not medal events, exhibitions and things like that, where you're having kind of athletes with disabilities participating in some way, and like you said, the torch lighting ceremony. So there's lots of famous moments like that. There is, of course, also moments, and this may be what you're going to ask about your second question, but there are moments where people cross over. Right, that there are athletes who have different impairments that end up competing in the Olympics. So there's been swimmers who were deaf, and other athletes and things like that have kind of crossed over. And so those tend to kind of generate a lot of kind of interest and sometimes bring extra attention to the Paralympics as well.
Well, here you go. Here's your most famous crossover athlete, which is Oscar Pistorius, who crossed over, was world famous. A national hero in Australia and even beyond. And ultimately, he ended up being more or less the O.J. Simpson of your sport. I suppose, he has no official standing with the Paralympics or anything like that. But how do the people involved in the sport feel about this? Did it damage the reputation of the Paralympics or anything?
I think in some people's minds, it probably did, because it always does anytime you have, an atrocity like that happen. And I think it is, in some respects, it may have been kind of past the kind of peak of his career. That was that famous moment where he competed in the Olympic Games, and then he actually competed in the Paralympic Games. He actually, if I remember correctly, he didn't win his race in the Paralympics. He actually was beat. And so, so there was a lot of kind of discussion about kind of like, he was this famous athlete that crossed over, but at the same time, it was, there's this kind of moment where the Paralympic athletes themselves are becoming better and better and better as well. So I think, it's one of those things where those things happen sometimes in sports. And, it doesn't necessarily, because he's not the sole, like you said, he's not the sole representative of the Paralympics. He's just kind of one athlete. And so the Paralympic movement, I don't think they don't talk about him clearly in many respects these days. But they have a lot of other stuff to talk about anyway. And I think that's the reality, is that kind of the Paralympic movement has just kind of continued to kind of grow and see kind of improvements in athlete performance and things like that, to the extent that now, like, they just have so many other athletes that they can talk about, that it doesn't have to be about just one person kind of setting the kind of image for the games.
Yeah, I think the typical sports fan believes that Pistorius was the first to cross over between the games, but he was actually like the 10th or 11th in history, even at that point, even in 2012 or whenever it was. So you don't have to talk about O.J. Simpson to still talk about football.
Exactly.
So, okay, of course, in 2008, there's another important moment, because Beijing hosts the Paralympics, and to no one's surprise, all of a sudden they're dominant, just as they are in women's sports in the Olympics. In your opinion, is this what we have to look forward to? Is China going to really dominate these games for a while yet?
I mean, that's what it looks like. All the indications are there that China they're investing money into Paralympic athletes, which is the difference. And I think, it'll be interesting. I'm actually kind of interested to see what happens for lots of reasons with Tokyo this year. But one of the things is that Japan this is one of the first times, I guess in 98, they invested pretty heavily too. And they actually had a big medal haul at the Paralympics. And so, but they've invested in some ways almost equally Paralympics and Olympic athletes. So, and so I think when you do something like that, suddenly that gives these athletes opportunities that they would have never have had otherwise. They've had more opportunities to compete internationally. They've had more opportunities to train. They have the very best equipment. And I think that that's partly what we're seeing on the Chinese side, is that their sports system is designed in a way to, achieve results. And so they've essentially kind of taken that system and said, we're going to do the same thing for the Paralympics. And again, that's my sense. I've not looked at the situation in China nearly as closely as I have the Japanese stuff, but that's, it makes sense that that's what's happening there. And I think it's probably going to continue to happen for a while.
Yeah, it's all about the money in international sport, right? So, and the organization.
Certainly a big factor.
We'll get back to the Truly the GOATs podcast in just a moment. But first, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique unique items with a retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row 1 catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row 1 Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.
Okay, this may be a loaded question. This year, the Olympics were quite controversial in Tokyo, in Japan. Are the Paralympics getting any blowback that are on right now?
So they are and they aren't. It's interesting. I mean, and it's really a developing story. So I mean, I'm kind of following this pretty closely for obvious reasons. And what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of people saying, we didn't have fans at the Olympics. The prime minister came out and said he would really like to see fans at the Paralympics. He said that even as the Olympics were going on with no fans. And I think a lot of people are like, well, considering the fact that the coronavirus actually seems to have gotten worse throughout the games in Japan, then if you try and have fans at the Paralympics, that seems ridiculous. Which I mean, so I'm not thinking they're going to have fans for one thing, but there is discussion around stuff like that. But I think what's been interesting is that it's really hard because part of the promotional materials around the Paralympics this year was that it was going to be, and part of around the Olympics too, was this is going to be Japan's way to kind of demonstrate a commitment to diversity and inclusion in society. And so the Paralympics, of course, were a key part of that. And they were going to really show kind of their commitment to kind of accessibility and barrier-free society in both kind of, a physical sense and in this kind of broader kind of we're kind to people with disabilities. And, so there's lots of kind of stuff that was marketed about that. And I think that a lot of people are looking at that kind of much more cynically than they would before. And part of that is because you're telling people, I mean, they just said recently, that, if you're not too sick, just stay home because we don't have enough hospital beds. And you're telling people that, which means you're putting people, your own society at risk, and probably it's vulnerable members of society at risk to host these games and to kind of do this at a moment. And so I think there's a lot of people that are kind of questioning some of those and seeing them kind of as kind of just talking points that maybe have no real significance, which is too bad because, I think there is a lot of people that took those very seriously, and there was some serious commitments that were made. But I don't know how they're gonna sort out in the end. And that's, again, I'm watching this pretty closely to kind of see how everything comes. I haven't seen quite the negative response of cancel the Paralympics that you saw with the Olympics, in part because I think a lot of people are like, well, it's already happened. But there is also concern because you're also talking about bringing some people in that are often kind of seen as being potentially more vulnerable to some of these things like COVID and things like that. So there's lots of questions again, and I'm to be honest, I'm kind of mixed emotions on it. Obviously, I've been studying this. I know a lot of people that are involved in it, but at the same time, I look at kind of the other people that I know in Japan that are kind of struggling to deal with COVID. And I'm like, it's a hard case. It's not a kind of straightforward. This should happen this way, I think.
Right. Okay. A little bit before the show, and since this is truly the GOATs, I'm obliged to ask you this. You mentioned some of the GOAT Paralympians of the past. Can you give us a couple of stories? Who are some of the GOAT athletes that you've seen?
Well, there's a ton, and I this is, like I said, I focus my work mainly on Japan, the Japan side. But you have people like Tani Gray out of Britain, who are pretty remarkable athletes, and I think now has been, is nobility officially or something, however they do that in England. So, but I mean, in the Japanese side, one of the people that I think is really kind of impressive that is not all that well known outside of Japan, I don't think, is Tsuchida Wakako. She's one of the few athletes to win gold in both kind of games, in the winter and summer games. She first started out winning medals in the Nagano Paralympics, won several events there. And then what ended up happening is those events had, relatively small numbers of competitors over the years. And so those got dropped from competition. So instead, she just switched to track and field events and was, at one point had the world record in the marathon. And so, so really impressive athlete, kind of all around athlete in many respects. You also have, I think one of the greatest wheelchair racers right now, Tatiana McFadden from the United States. Has just is blowing all records away left and right, and the same thing's happening kind of on the men's team, men's side with marathons and stuff like that. So there's, I mean, we're looking at kind of, I think the Paralympics right now have some of the best athletes we've ever seen in some respects. And that's always kind of hard to say because, it's all, as truly the GOATs, right? What do you mean by that? But I think if you're just looking at kind of the level of competition that they're dealing with, the level of competition has just escalated everywhere. And so you're seeing kind of really, really impressive performances. And if you want to see a really, really amazing tennis matches, check out any tennis match with Shingo Kunieda playing. I mean, remarkable, just the way he kind of moves the chair and the racket and the ball around. It's amazing to watch. So I enjoy watching athletes like that play. So yeah, there's some great competition out there. It's well worth kind of checking out. And this year, I think there's going to be a lot more coverage. This is one of the first years NBC is doing like a lot of coverage.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So
great.
Definitely kind of an opportunity to kind of really check things out this year, I think.
Yeah, I was wondering if I was going to get to see this at all. I think Tatiana McFadden needs some better PR people because that's a great American name. That's awesome. I mean, that's America, right?
Yeah.
That you could have somebody named Tatiana McFadden like playing in the Paralympics and starring.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, she needs some PR. Okay, just I guess final question is the obvious one. What do you see happening in the future with the games? Do you see a brighter future, more sports? What do you think?
I think they're getting pretty close to maxed out. I think because part of that is that they are tied to the Olympics, and so you're approaching this point where diminishing returns, I guess maybe, right? Where are people just gonna be like, okay, I've had enough, right? We've got like 2 months worth of Olympics, Paralympics. And so, if we kind of keep adding more stuff, you have to keep expanding the time frame. And so, I do think, like I said, the level of competition, partly because, the athletes are better. Also, equipment is improved. Like the sports chairs now are just remarkable. They're these like miniature rockets. I mean, I think, and they're like all scientifically designed and, human propelled rockets, of course, right? But and then, the other equipment that people are using, it's, top of the line stuff. You've got major companies that are designing things. Honda has participated in designing chairs for Japanese athletes and things like that. So I mean, you've got like in terms of the level performance, I think it's just going to keep going up at the Paralympic level. What I hope, and this is kind of, part of one of the things that I kind of, again, part of this gets into the personal stuff here, is I hope that we'll continue to see, this spread kind of beyond the elite level. And that, in some ways, the only way you can get that elite level is if you have some grassroots stuff before you get there. And that grassroots stuff in some places is doing fine. Like I said, we happen to be in an area where we've got pretty solid programs, but you move, an hour away from where I live, that means those people got to drive another hour beyond what I drive already, right? So to get to the programs that we use, and there's just nothing else. So they've got to, so it's really kind of scattered, and that grassroots kind of approach is I think kind of, is key in lots of sites. It's definitely true in Japan. I think you're starting to see it kind of take off at a grassroots level. It has happened, and one of the things I talk about in my book is that it has happened for a long time in certain places. You're seeing it spread kind of other places as well now. And in the U.S., I think that there is this growing interest in adapted sports at the college level. And so we'll see what that translates to in the next few years. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff. I also think I was just actually talking to some folks about this, is that the Paralympics, the Olympics is I think has been controversial, is continuing to be controversial for a number of years. And is likely to continue to be controversial for lots of reasons. The Paralympics have not had that same degree of controversy. I guess what I hope is that they can dodge and avoid some of the problems that the Olympics have had, and kind of sort out some of those things. Maybe they've watched what has happened to the Olympics and say, oh, we don't want to go that way. But it's up in the air. It's a major international sports event, and those generate problems. I mean, that's just the nature of kind of an event of that size and that scale. So we'll see. Interesting future ahead for sure.
That's an interesting take on the grassroots thing, because if you think about it, the Paralympics are being formed at about the same time when professional leagues are really starting to assert their dominance. So it's almost like the Paralympics had to start from the top down rather than the bottom up in this respect.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely in certain sports have had that more than others, right? You've really had to kind of build up. Some of them have kind of built bottom up. Wheelchair basketball is probably the most famous example that there was lots of wheelchair basketball that's happened, and then it kind of consolidated around this international kind of events.
Right.
But a lot of other sports, they aside from the Paralympics, they just don't get much attention at the local level, and so it's it's really hard to kind of promote it.
Well, that's the other thing that happened post World War II, right? Where all of a sudden your local baseball team wasn't the headline of the sport page. It was the nearest professional baseball team.
Right,
exactly. Even if that was in Kansas City and you were in, Colorado, you still heard about the Kansas City A's, for God's sake.
Right.
All right, Dennis Frost, thanks very much for joining us again. Maybe we'll have you again sometime. I don't know if we've talked about everything we can possibly talk about.
Well, anytime you want to have me, I'm happy to be back.
Thanks a bunch, Dennis.
Thanks. Take care.
This has been Truly the Goats, a Sports History Network podcast. To find us online, visit trulythegoats.com. On Twitter and Facebook, we're at Truly the Goats. For more like-minded shows, be sure to check out sportshistorynetwork.com. Like the man says, it's
your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport.
Truly the Goats thanks our guest for this episode. It's Dr. Dennis Frost of Kalamazoo College. Dennis's latest book, More Than Medals, is available from Cornell University Press at cornellpress.cornell.edu, and of course through the usual online outlets for books as well. The Truly the Goats theme song is Fun on Street, greatest remix of all time, and is produced by David Liso of Dynamo Stairs. This is Oz Davis for Truly the Goats and the Sports History Network saying, always keep perspective.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.